All right, safety pros, ready to dive into some scaffold safety. Today we are taking a deep dive into OSHA Standard 1926 Subpart L.
All about scaffolds.
Everything scaffold.
Yeah, that's right.
Whether you are a seasoned safety manager or just starting out, this deep dive is going to be valuable for you.
It really is. This standard is the foundation of keeping workers safe when they are working on scaffolds. So understanding it is essential.
And getting familiar with this standard, it's not just about checking boxes.
Right.
It's about really understanding why these rules are in place. Because with scaffolds, the stakes are high.
They are.
We're talking about preventing serious injuries, even fatalities.
Absolutely. OSHA recognizes that, and that's why Subpart L is so comprehensive. Think of it as a safety blueprint.
A blueprint.
For all things scaffold related.
I like that. Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty, can you just give us a quick rundown of what Subpart L actually covers?
Sure. Subpart L applies to basically every type of scaffold you would find on a construction site.
Okay.
Renovation project, as long as it falls under OSHA 1926.
Yeah. So we're talking everything from those basic tube and coupler scaffolds to the more specialized ones.
Even those. But there are some exceptions. Things like crane suspended platforms and aerial lifts have their own specific standards because they have unique risks associated with them.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to apply the same rules to a suspended platform as you would to a rolling scaffold.
Exactly. That's why the standards are separate.
Speaking of specifics, when I was looking through this standard, I came across some pretty interesting terms.
Oh, yeah.
Some of them even made me chuckle. Like, for example, what in the world is a bosun's chair? Sounds like something a pirate would use.
It does sound a little swashbuckling, but it's not too far off. A bosun's chair is basically a single-point adjustable suspension scaffold. It's basically a seat.
A seat.
Suspended from a single rope, and it's used for tasks where you need to be suspended at a height to perform a task.
Wow. I can see why that one would require extra attention in the safety department.
For sure.
And then there's another term, a crawling board, or as they also call it, a chicken ladder.
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
It paints quite a picture, doesn't it?
It does.
It's basically a plank with cleats attached.
Oh, okay.
For sloped surfaces. Usually it's used on a roof to give you a little something to grip onto.
I can only imagine.
I'm not sure I'd want to be on one.
You'd have to have nerves of steel to be walking on one of those.
You would, but these terms highlight the range of situations the standard has to address. It's not just about those common scaffolds. It's about making sure worker safety is covered even in those unique, kind of dangerous situations.
And that brings us to the heart of Subpart L. The general scaffold requirements outlined in 1926.451. This is where things get real.
This is where the rubber meets the road. This section lays out those fundamental safety principles that apply to all scaffolds.
Right.
Things like capacity, platform construction, fall protection, falling object protection.
Got it.
It's the foundation on which everything else is built.
Okay, so let's break that down. Let's start with capacity. I know this is a big one.
It is.
What are the key takeaways here for safety professionals?
Scaffolds have to be strong enough to support the intended load.
Okay.
And the standard mandates that they must be able to support at least 4 times the intended load. That's a huge safety factor.
4 times. So if you're planning to have, say, 1,000 pounds of workers and materials on a scaffold,
Yeah.
it needs to be able to handle at least 4,000 pounds.
At least.
Wow.
And it's not just about the weight itself. It's about making sure it can handle the force that comes with use.
Right.
The movement, the wind, even just the way materials are placed on the platform,
Right.
It can all impact stability.
So how do you actually determine the capacity of a scaffold? Is there some sort of formula or a calculation?
This is where the competent person comes in.
Okay.
The standard relies heavily on them to assess capacity, identify hazards, and make sure the scaffold is built and used correctly.
The competent person. Seems like their judgment is crucial in so many aspects of scaffold safety. So it's not just about blindly following the rules. It's about having someone with knowledge and experience to apply these principles in real-world situations.
Exactly. And when it comes to capacity, that competent person has to consider a lot of factors. The type of scaffold, the materials used, the height, what it's being used for.
Okay.
It's a complex assessment.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we've talked about capacity. What about platform construction? Are there specific things safety pros need to watch out for?
Absolutely. This is where the standard gets pretty detailed.
Okay.
For example, there's the 1-inch gap rule. Basically, the spaces between the platform units and between the platform and the uprights should generally be no wider than 1 inch.
Why 1 inch specifically? What's the reasoning behind that?
Well, you have to think about tools, materials.
Right.
Even a worker's foot could easily slip through a larger gap.
Right.
That 1-inch limit is all about preventing things from falling through and potentially injuring someone below.
Right. You don't want tools or materials falling from a height onto someone below.
Exactly. Of course, there are exceptions to this rule, but again, it's up to the competent person to determine when those exceptions apply.
Sensing a theme here.
Competent person, competent person.
But in all seriousness, it really highlights the importance of having someone on site who understands this standard and can make those judgment calls. What else is in this section on platform construction?
Well, we've also got minimum width requirements. Platforms need to be wide enough to allow workers to move around safely.
Right.
And those widths can vary depending on the type of scaffold and the task being performed.
Makes sense. You wouldn't want a narrow platform if workers are carrying large or heavy material.
You wouldn't.
They'll have room to maneuver.
And finally, there are rules about how platform units should overlap over their supports. Again, it's all about ensuring stability and preventing weak points in the platform.
So there's more to platform construction than just throwing some planks down.
There is.
There's a real science to it.
There is. And we haven't even gotten to one of the most crucial aspects of scaffold safety.
Right.
Fall protection. But I think that deserves its own discussion, don't you?
Absolutely. That's a topic that can never be overemphasized.
Let's talk about fall protection. It's really one of the most important things when it comes to scaffolds.
For sure.
OSHA's very serious about protecting workers from falls.
So what does Subpart L actually say about fall protection?
The main rule is if you're on a scaffold 10 feet or higher, you need fall protection. No exceptions.
10 feet, got it. So anything above that, you have to have something in place.
Exactly. And this is where those interesting scaffold types we talked about earlier come back into play. Imagine working on a bosun's chair.
Oh my gosh.
Or a crawling board at that height.
The thought of being suspended from a single rope like that, it makes my stomach drop.
It's not for everyone, that's for sure.
I can't even imagine.
And that's why the standard is so strict about fall protection for those situations. It outlines several different options like guardrails or personal fall arrest systems.
Right.
But it also stresses that these systems have to be attached correctly and inspected frequently.
So it's not just about having the equipment, it's about making sure it's all in working order.
Exactly. A frayed rope or a loose connection is just as bad as having no fall protection at all.
What about situations where the work itself is already risky? Like if workers are welding on a scaffold?
Yeah.
Are there special precautions for that?
Absolutely. When you're welding on a scaffold, you've got the added danger of electrical hazards, and the standard addresses that. There are rules about grounding and insulation to protect both the workers and the equipment. We could talk more about those in detail later.
We should, because that sounds really important, but also complex.
It is a bit complex, but it is essential for safety.
Okay, so we've talked about protecting the people on the scaffold, but Subpart L also talks about something else important.
Right.
Falling object protection.
It's about protecting anyone who might be below.
Makes sense. A tool or a piece of material falling from even 10 feet could do some real damage.
Absolutely, and the standard gives you some options for protecting those below. Toe boards, screens, debris nets. Sometimes the best thing to do is just remove any objects that could fall in the first place.
Okay, so a lot of different approaches depending on what the situation calls for.
Exactly. Safety is a 360-degree concern.
So we've covered the general requirements from 1926.451, but there's a lot more to this standard. What about the different types of scaffolds? Does Subpart L go through each one individually?
It does in section 1926.452.
Okay.
And this is where things get really detailed.
So we're getting into the weeds now.
We are, but understanding these rules for specific scaffold types is important for anyone working in safety.
Because a scaffold is not just a scaffold.
Right.
Different types come with different risks, and they need different safety measures.
Exactly. And if you use the wrong measures, the consequences can be serious.
Okay, so what are some of the key scaffold types we should be familiar with?
We can start with tube and coupler scaffolds. They're one of the most common.
Okay, I know those. They're made with tubes connected by couplers.
Yeah. But how do you keep them from being wobbly?
That's what I was thinking. How do you make sure they're stable?
It all comes down to bracing.
Okay.
The standard has really specific rules about bracing depending on how high the scaffold is and how it's configured.
So it's not just a matter of sticking some tubes and couplers together randomly.
It's not. That's why you need skilled workers who understand these requirements.
All right, tube and coupler scaffolds. Check. What else is there?
Let's talk about mobile scaffolds, the ones with wheels.
Ah, yes, the ones that move. I could see how those could be dangerous, moving a whole structure with people on it.
Right, and that's why the rules for mobile scaffolds are so strict.
Okay.
There are limits on how steep a surface can be, the ratio of height to base when you're moving it.
Gotcha.
And you can't ride on them unless certain conditions are met.
No joyriding on the mobile scaffold?
Definitely not. Safety comes first.
Okay, so tube and coupler, mobile. Anything else?
Let's take a look at something a bit less common. Repair bracket scaffolds.
Okay, so just from the name, I'm guessing they're used for, well, repairs.
You got it. They're used for structures like chimneys, tanks, silos.
I can see that.
Things that are difficult to get to with normal scaffolds.
So what kinds of safety measures are there for repair bracket scaffolds?
Because these repairs can be complex, the standard is extra cautious. You have to use wire rope for support and positive locking devices to hold the brackets to the structure.
Right.
There are lots of measures to make sure it's stable and doesn't detach.
So it's about choosing the right safety measures for the type of scaffold and the type of work you're doing.
Precisely. And that's why really understanding Subpart L is so important. The more you know, the safer your work environment will be.
We've talked about the general requirements, specific types of scaffolds. It's a lot of information.
It is.
But there's one more piece to this puzzle, right? Training. We can have all these rules, but if people don't know how to use them, they're useless.
Exactly. That's why Subpart L has a whole section on training.
What does OSHA require when it comes to scaffold safety training?
There are two levels of training. First, there's hazard recognition training.
Okay.
This applies to anyone who's going to be working on a scaffold, whether they're building it, taking it down, or just doing their job on it.
So even if I'm just a painter using a scaffold to reach a high spot, I still need this training.
You do. It's all about being able to identify hazards and knowing the basic safety rules.
So it's about awareness.
Right. It helps to create a culture of safety.
And what about the second level of training?
That one's for anyone building, taking apart, or inspecting scaffolds.
Okay.
It gets into the technical stuff, like how much weight the scaffold can hold, how to brace it properly, the engineering behind it all.
So the people who are actually putting these scaffolds together need a much deeper understanding.
They do. They need to know not just what to do, but why they're doing it.
And I'm guessing this training isn't something you do once and you're good forever.
You're right. OSHA is clear that you need refresher training if the worksite changes or if someone's not following the safety rules.
So it's a process of continually learning and reinforcing good habits.
That's right. And you know, there's another part of Subpart L that's really valuable.
Oh.
It's not mandatory, but it gives you a lot of good guidance.
I'm listening.
There are several appendices in Subpart L that have extra information.
Honest material, that's always good.
One of the most useful is Appendix A, which has scaffold specifications. It goes into detail about things like how long your planks can be, how much weight different parts can handle, even diagrams of bracing patterns.
So if I'm trying to figure out the right size lumber for a scaffold, I could use Appendix A.
Exactly. It takes out a lot of the guesswork.
Okay, what else?
There's Appendix C, which lists national consensus standards that go along with Subpart L.
So these are standards that are even stricter than the minimum OSHA requirements.
Right. They add an extra layer of safety. For example, there are standards specifically for aerial lifts that are even more detailed than Subpart L.
So it's like you're going above and beyond to be extra safe.
That's a good way to put it. And there's another appendix, Appendix D, that I think is really useful for safety professionals.
What's that one about?
This one outlines what should be included in training for people who build and take down scaffolds.
So it goes back to that specialized training we were talking about.
It does. It covers everything from the general scaffold rules to the specific steps for different types of scaffolds.
Okay.
Like how to put together a rolling scaffold, a tube and clamp scaffold, even a system scaffold. It talks about fall protection, moving materials safely, and using the right personal protective equipment.
So this appendix is like a roadmap for making sure your training program is good.
It is. It really highlights how important training is. It's not enough to just meet the bare minimum requirements. You have to give your workers the knowledge they need to stay safe.
Subpart L is incredibly detailed.
It is.
It's definitely complex.
But that's because scaffolds can be dangerous, so it's necessary.
You know, there's one topic we talked about before that I'd like to discuss a little more.
Okay.
Welding on scaffolds. That seemed pretty intense.
It is something that requires a lot of attention to detail.
All right, so let's get back to welding on scaffolds.
Okay.
It seems like a pretty inherently risky combination.
It can be. The biggest concern is the potential for the welding current to, well, go where it's not supposed to.
Okay.
You've got all that electricity and a lot of metal, and that can create hazards.
Yeah, especially on those suspended scaffolds with the wire ropes.
Exactly.
You don't want that current running through the scaffold.
You don't, and that's why Subpart L is so strict about insulation and grounding when you're welding on a scaffold.
So let's talk about the requirements. Where do we even begin with this?
Well, first you need insulation.
Okay.
Subpart L says you need an insulated thimble everywhere a wire rope connects to its support,
Okay.
like a cornice hook or an outrigger beam.
So you're basically creating a barrier between the wire rope and the metal support so the current can't flow through.
Right, and you also need to insulate any excess wire rope and any independent grounding lines.
So the ropes are covered. What about the hoist?
Those are usually metal, too.
Right.
And that's why Subpart L says you have to cover them with insulated protective covers.
To keep them from coming into contact with the current.
Exactly.
Right. So the ropes are insulated. The hoist is insulated. What else is there?
Grounding.
Oh.
You need to ground both the worker and the welding equipment so that if any current does stray, it goes safely into the ground.
Grounding. Yeah, I remember that from basic electrical safety.
It's all about giving the current a safe path to the earth, one with low resistance.
Right.
And Subpart L is really specific about how you ground a scaffold.
How so?
Besides the normal work lathe that you use for welding, you need a separate grounding conductor going from the scaffold to the structure.
So there are two grounding paths.
Yes, one for the welding and one specifically for the scaffold.
And they can't be connected together.
That's right, they have to be separate.
This is where I start to lose track a bit.
Yeah.
Why all these specifics?
It's about controlling the electricity.
Okay.
We want to make absolutely sure that the current goes where it's supposed to go, through the workpiece and back to the machine, and not through the scaffold.
Right, and definitely not through the worker.
Definitely not. It's like giving the electricity its own designated lane.
I like that analogy.
And Subpart L has even more rules about this.
Okay, like what?
If that grounding conductor ever gets disconnected, even for a second, you have to shut down the welding machine immediately.
No exceptions.
No exceptions. And the worker has to be super careful not to touch the scaffold with the welding rod or any uninsulated part of the lead.
It sounds like there's no room for mistakes here.
There really isn't. Welding on a scaffold is risky, and you have to understand these precautions.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
Everything from the basics of Subpart L to those really specific rules for different types of scaffolds, and even the complicated stuff about welding.
It's a lot to take in, but hopefully our listeners now have a much better understanding of how important scaffold safety really is.
For anyone out there involved in scaffold work, I encourage you to read OSHA 1926 Subpart L and really understand it.
It could save lives.
And if you want even more information, check out Safety One Source.
They have tons of great resources.
Videos, training materials, all sorts of things to help you create a safer workplace. You can find them on their website and YouTube channel.
I want to thank you for having me on today.
It was great having you.
It's been a pleasure.
And to all of our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into scaffold safety. Until next time, stay safe out there